Dr. Malcolm Ellis, a successful black surgeon and CEO, fights to launch a healthcare initiative for underserved communities in Elmsford, but faces relentless opposition from a corrupt system that refuses to accept him. Despite his achievements, Malcolm is constantly undermined by racial biases, dismissed as unworthy and a pawn by powerful figures like Officer Daniels, who embodies the systemic racism in the town's leadership. As he pushes for change, Malcolm must navigate microaggressions, public disrespect, and open threats, all while confronting the deeply rooted prejudices that seek to silence him and invalidate his work. Dr. Malcolm Ellis didn't mind the drive. In fact, he rather enjoyed it. The open road was a quiet reprieve from the endless meetings, surgeries, and media inquiries that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The engine hummed steadily beneath him as he drove his modest black sedan through the tree-lined streets of Elmsford. His hands, steady on the wheel, had a certain calm to them that contrasted sharply with the high-stakes surgeries he performed each day at St. James Hospital. Malcolm didn't need the car. He had more than enough money to drive a sleek sports vehicle or hire a chauffeur if he wished. But something about this small sedan, a far cry from the luxury cars owned by his colleagues, was grounding. It was his way of remaining connected to the simpler things in life, reminding himself where he came from, even as his position in the world became ever more elevated. The sun was setting, casting an amber hue over the city as he neared the diner at the edge of town. It was a local spot that he had frequented for years, a place where he wasn't Dr. Malcolm Ellis, the celebrated surgeon and CEO of the region's leading healthcare network. Here, he was just a quiet man enjoying a meal, his face known to only a few regulars who had long ago stopped asking questions about his life. They were content to just see him as another face in the crowd, which, for Malcolm, was a comfort. He parked the car, adjusted his navy blue blazer, and stepped out, making sure to lock the doors before heading inside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and he was immediately met with the warm scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. The diner was half full, mostly older folks sipping coffee or chatting with waitstaff. Malcolm's presence, though familiar to him, always seemed to draw a brief, curious glance here and there, but it was nothing he couldn't ignore. His focus was on the food, the comfort of the place, the anonymity. He slid into a booth in the back corner, as he always did. There was no need for anything extravagant, just a seat by the window where he could watch the world outside, the lights from passing cars casting soft shadows on the walls. A waitress, a woman in her late 50s, with tired but kind eyes, approached his table. "Good evening, Dr. Ellis. The usual?" she asked, her voice a blend of warmth and weariness. Malcolm smiled and nodded, his deep-set eyes filled with both gratitude and a quiet exhaustion. "Yes, thanks, Linda. How's the night going?" "Oh, Linda said with a small chuckle. "Same old busy, but nothing we can't handle." She scribbled down his order on her pad. "I'll bring that out in a minute." Malcolm leaned back in his booth, his fingers lightly tapping on the edge of the table. The diner's quiet hum was soothing, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the hospital where he spent most of his days. Here, in this humble place, he could shed the weight of his title and simply be Malcolm, the man who grew up on the tough streets of Elmsford, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, who fought through the barriers of racism and poverty to become one of the most respected figures in the medical field. But even in a place like this, there were reminders that his skin color and social status were things that would never let him be fully anonymous. As Malcolm gazed out the window, his attention was momentarily drawn to a small group of men sitting at the counter. They were talking loudly, laughing as one of them pounded the counter. Apparently, in the middle of a story Malcolm didn't recognize them. But their conversation grew suddenly quieter when they noticed him sitting there. Malcolm shifted slightly in his seat, trying to ignore the feeling that had begun to settle in his chest. It wasn't anything new. He'd dealt with this kind of subtle, uncomfortable attention his whole life. It was the same thing he'd experienced throughout his career, whether in the boardrooms or operating rooms, the dismissive stares, the offhand comments, the underestimation. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, even when it wasn't overt. Here, in this diner, in the small moments like these, it seemed to creep back into his consciousness more than anywhere else. A young man, probably in his 20s, turned his head to look at him, then nudged his friend, pointing subtly in Malcolm's direction. The gesture wasn't malicious, just curious. Malcolm knew exactly what they were thinking. They were probably wondering why a man like him, dressed in a sharp blazer, was sitting in a diner like this. It didn't make sense to them. Linda returned with his meal, setting a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and hash browns in front of him. "Here you go," she said with a smile. "Let me know if you need anything else." "Thanks, Linda," Malcolm replied, his voice warm and sincere. He didn't want to acknowledge the discomfort he felt, but knew it would stay with him, just like the endless microaggressions he faced in the world outside this diner. At St. James as CEO, he had the power to influence major decisions about healthcare policy, but in the eyes of some, he was still just another black man. And he would never be allowed to forget it. The conversation at the counter had resumed, but the tone had shifted. Malcolm could hear snippets of their dialogue, no longer about sports or the weather, but something else entirely. "Did you hear that new surgeon at St. James is some hotshot?" one of them said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Yeah, the one who's got the whole town talking Malcolm Ellis. They say he's a genius with those brain surgeries, but I don't know. I always thought doctors like him shouldn't be around here." The comment struck Malcolm like a blow, but he didn't let it show. His fork paused mid-air as he swallowed the bile that rose in his throat. The worst part wasn't the remark itself, but the realization that it wasn't a new sentiment. It was just another variation of the kind of prejudice he had battled since he was a young boy. As a child, he had been told time and time again by society that people like him, black, working class, didn't belong in spaces of power. He wasn't supposed to be a top surgeon, a CEO, a leader in a predominantly white field. But Malcolm had fought tooth and nail to get where he was, and yet, these whispers, these small dismissals, always followed him like a shadow. Malcolm took a deep breath, setting down his fork and staring out the window. He wasn't angry. He didn't have the luxury of being angry anymore. Anger wouldn't change anything, not the way he needed it to. But there were moments, like this one, when he couldn't help but wonder, what would it take for people to see him as more than just the color of his skin or the title in front of his name? He had fought hard to prove himself, and yet, there were still days when his worth was measured by his race, and sometimes, that was the most difficult challenge of all. The door jingled as it opened, and a man in a tan overcoat walked in. He looked around, and spotting the open booth at the back, made his way toward Malcolm. The man's gait was assured, his suit crisp, the kind of attire that screamed wealth and status. "Excuse me," the man said, pausing at the edge of Malcolm's booth. "Is this seat taken?" Malcolm looked up, offering a polite nod. "No, not at all. Please have a seat." The man sat down without another word, glancing at the menu on the table, as if the diner were a five-star restaurant rather than the no-frills establishment it was. It wasn't long before the man looked up again, his brow furrowed in confusion. He was staring at Malcolm now, his eyes scanning his face, unsure whether he recognized him or if the resemblance was just coincidence. "Wait a minute, you're Malcolm Ellis, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice now tinged with surprise. "The neurosurgeon?" Malcolm smiled faintly, nodding. "I am." The man paused, a look of awe creeping onto his face. "Wow, I never thought I'd run into you here," he said, shaking his head. "I've read about your work, what you've done for the community. It's impressive, really." Malcolm felt a mix of discomfort and gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, not wanting to dwell on his achievements. His mind was still clouded with the words from the counter, the whispers of doubt that lingered in the air like smoke. The man continued, "I've got a cousin who works at St. James, says you're one of the best, but, honestly, I didn't think someone like you would be eating at a place like this." The comment, though not intentionally malicious, stung. There it was again. The assumption that his presence in such a humble place was somehow out of place. Malcolm's smile tightened. He'd heard it all before. "Sometimes," Malcolm replied, his voice calm but with a slight edge. "It's nice to remember where you came from." The man blinked, taken aback by the response, but said nothing more. For a moment, there was a strange kind of quiet understanding between them, an unspoken realization that Malcolm didn't quite belong here, and yet, here he was, choosing to remain grounded. The moment passed quickly, and the man, sensing that he might have overstepped, turned his attention to the menu. Malcolm's thoughts drifted again, this time toward the hospital. There was a large board meeting coming up in the morning, one that would be filled with tension. He could already sense it, just like the weight of the looks he would receive from some of his colleagues when they saw him walk into the room. They weren't sure about him. They weren't sure if he belonged in the spaces he'd worked so hard to carve out for himself. But Malcolm knew the battle wasn't over. It wasn't over at the hospital, and it wasn't over in this quiet diner. The fight for respect, for acknowledgement, for true equality, it would be an ongoing journey. Malcolm left the diner feeling unsettled, the weight of the encounter with the man at the counter still hanging heavily in his mind. Despite his best efforts to remain grounded, it seemed that no matter how much he achieved, he would always be seen through the lens of his race. As he drove home, the familiar quiet hum of the road offered little comfort. The city of Elmsford was still as he remembered it, but the world around him felt different, harsher, more scrutinizing than before. He pulled into his driveway, the house quiet and unassuming, just like he preferred. It was a far cry from the extravagant mansions of his colleagues. A modest 3-bedroom home tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, it reflected the values his parents had instilled in him: humility, family, and dedication. He didn't need the lavish lifestyle his success could afford. Here, he could be just Malcolm, the man who had worked for everything he had, the man who understood the value of hard work and the importance of staying connected to his roots. Inside, the house was just as he left it, a quiet sanctuary. His wife, Ava, was in the kitchen, finishing up dinner. The sound of her humming softly to herself filled the air. Malcolm smiled, a moment of peace in an otherwise chaotic day. "How was your day, babe?" Ava asked without turning around, sensing him as he entered the room. Malcolm hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to express the frustration that had been building inside him. "Busy same as always," he said, his voice calm but carrying a layer of exhaustion. I don't know. It feels like every time I take a step forward, something or someone pulls me 2 steps back." Ava looked up at him, her expression softening. She knew him better than anyone else. "Is it that meeting tomorrow with the board?" Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, the one about the new surgery program. I'm pushing for something big, something that could change the way we approach brain tumors. But it's not just the work, it's everything around it. The subtle ways people look at me like I don't belong, the way they question my qualifications before they even hear what I have to say." Ava set the spoon down and walked over to him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "I know it's tough, but you're doing great. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are." Malcolm smiled, appreciating her support, but knowing deep down that her encouragement couldn't erase the reality he faced daily. Every victory felt like it came with a price that was rarely acknowledged by those in positions of power. After dinner, Malcolm tried to relax in the living room, but his mind kept drifting back to the diner, to the judgmental looks and the whispered words that always seemed to follow him. He pulled out his phone to check his emails, but his attention was soon drawn to a message from his assistant, Claire. "Dr. Ellis, there's been a situation. The mayor's office called. They want to discuss your upcoming initiative on expanding healthcare access for the underserved communities in Elmsford. It seems there are concerns about the cost and how it might affect the hospital's bottom line. I'm not sure if they fully understand what you're trying to accomplish. They've suggested you tone down your ideas for the upcoming press conference." Malcolm's fingers froze on the screen. He'd been pushing for months to get funding for a program that would provide free or low-cost healthcare to marginalized communities in Elmsford, the very communities he had grown up in. The idea that it might be watered down because of concerns about its financial impact infuriated him. He set the phone down, his brow furrowed. "Tone it down," he muttered to himself. "Like my patients don't matter." Ava walked in, sensing the shift in his mood. "What's wrong?" "They're trying to silence me," Malcolm said, frustration creeping into his voice. "The mayor's office, people who should be on my side, they're pushing back against the program. They don't care about the people who need it the most. They care about their budgets, they care about appearances, and they want me to back down." Ava sighed, sitting beside him. "Malcolm, you fought harder than anyone I know. Don't let them take away the one thing you know is right." "I won't," he replied, his voice steady, but there was an undercurrent of anger he struggled to contain. He had fought for every position he had, earned every bit of recognition, but nothing seemed to change the fundamental truth. People were still determined to see him as less than, still determined to place limits on his success, his worth, based on the color of his skin. The next day, as Malcolm prepared for the board meeting at St. James, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had taken hold. The drive into the hospital felt different today, as though he were heading into a battleground where the stakes had never been higher. His assistant had warned him about the pressure, but he was ready for it. He always was. But the moment he stepped into the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted. He could feel the eyes on him, the subtle tension in the air. The room was filled with familiar faces: doctors, hospital administrators, board members. But there was one person missing: Mayor Whitaker. Normally, the mayor would have been at a meeting like this, especially since the program he was advocating for had the potential to change the trajectory of healthcare in the region. But this time, she was absent. Instead, a man by the name of Greg Hayes, a city councilman who had a reputation for being notoriously conservative, was sitting in her place. "Dr. Ellis, thank you for joining us," Greg Hayes said, as he glanced up from a stack of papers, his tone polite but uninviting. He didn't stand to shake Malcolm's hand, a small but telling gesture that Malcolm couldn't help but notice. Malcolm nodded, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you for having me, Councilman. I'm glad we could have this conversation." Hayes didn't respond, his eyes scanning the room. "Let's get to the point," he said, his voice carrying the air of someone used to controlling the conversation. "You're proposing a healthcare initiative that, frankly, I don't think is financially viable. The hospital's budget is stretched thin as it is, and with all due respect, I don't think your vision of providing healthcare to underserved communities is grounded in reality." Malcolm took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. He had been through countless meetings where his proposals were dismissed or watered down, but this felt different. This wasn't about the merit of the program. It was about the people behind it, the people they didn't think belonged in positions of power, the people they believed were always asking for too much. "I think you're mistaken, Councilman," Malcolm said, keeping his voice steady. "This program isn't about taking from the hospital's resources, it's about giving people the care they deserve, the people you've ignored for too long." Hayes raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Dr. Ellis, you're certainly passionate, but passion doesn't pay the bills." A hush fell over the room. Malcolm's heart pounded, but he remained composed. He knew this was coming. He had been prepared for this moment his entire life, the moment when his voice, his authority, his position, would be undermined by those who didn't see him as worthy of being in this room. "I understand the financial concerns, but this is about more than just dollars and cents," Malcolm said, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is about lives, about families who don't have access to care, about a community that's been left behind, and I'm not going to back down just because it's inconvenient." For a moment, the room was silent, and Malcolm could feel the weight of the gaze from the other board members. He had always known the stakes were high, but in this room, it felt like he was fighting not just for the success of his program, but for his very place at the table. Hayes looked at him, his gaze cold, dismissive. "We'll see about that," he said, clearly uninterested in further discussion. The tension in the room was palpable as the meeting dragged on. Every word spoken felt like an attempt to chip away at Malcolm's resolve, to make him question his place. The subtle microaggressions, the tone of Hayes's voice, the dismissive glances from some of the other board members, built an invisible wall around him, one that Malcolm had been fighting against for years. As the meeting ended, Malcolm stood up, his shoulders stiff with frustration. He had fought to be there, fought to have his voice heard, but it felt like he was just another black man trying to push against a system that was determined to keep him in his place. Malcolm stood by the elevator, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had expected pushback from the board meeting, but nothing could have prepared him for the overt resistance, the outright disdain they had shown. He had tried to remain calm, had tried to present his case with logic and compassion. But the moment Councilman Hayes spoke, it was clear to him. This was never about the program. This was about silencing him, about making him feel small in a room full of people who had no respect for him or the community he served. The elevator doors slid open, and Malcolm stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor, his mind still swirling with the sting of the meeting. His assistant Claire had texted him about a follow-up with the mayor's office. But after the events of the morning, Malcolm wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that he had a chance to make a real difference in Elmsford. The fight was rigged from the start. As the elevator ascended, the familiar feeling of frustration bubbled up inside him. His mind wandered back to the diner, to the interactions that had made him feel like an outsider. Despite his success, he had hoped the meeting would be different, that somehow, for once, his position as the CEO would afford him the respect he deserved. But it was becoming increasingly clear that his achievements were not enough. They would always see him as something else, someone who didn't belong in their world of high society privilege. When the doors opened, Malcolm exited the elevator and walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The office was just as polished as the rest of the building, gleaming glass windows, artwork on the walls, sleek conference tables. It was a world he had navigated for years but never fully belonged to. He knocked softly before entering, his eyes immediately landing on the familiar face of Mitchell, the hospital's PR director. Mitchell was a good man, loyal and well-meaning, but he was also part of the system that had always looked at Malcolm from a distance. He had witnessed the struggles Malcolm had endured, but like most people in positions of power, he was hesitant to take risks. "Dr. Ellis," Mitchell said, standing as he approached, "I've got the figures you requested on the projected outcomes of your initiative. It's impressive, honestly, but I'm not sure we're going to win this battle with the board. Hayes and the others are digging in their heels. Mitchell," Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm not here to discuss numbers. I'm here because I need a strategy, something that's actually going to break through all this resistance. I need you to help me find a way to make them understand. This isn't just about the hospital's bottom line, it's about people's lives." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "I get it, I really do. But you know how this works. You're asking them to make a huge financial commitment, and you're asking it from people who aren't always going to see the bigger picture. These aren't the kinds of battles we win just by pushing harder." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "I didn't get here by playing it safe, Mitchell. I'm not backing down." "Not now, not ever." Mitchell hesitated, his gaze falling to the ground. "I know. But there are more subtle ways we can approach this. Maybe if we tone down some of the rhetoric, take a more pragmatic approach, we can still win them over." Malcolm clenched his jaw, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to spill over. "Pragmatic? That's your solution? After everything we've done, all the lives we've touched, you want me to back off just because they don't want to deal with the truth?" Before Mitchell could respond, there was a knock at the door. Malcolm's mind was too consumed with frustration to even acknowledge the interruption. He turned toward the sound of the knock, but the door opened before he could react. "Dr. Ellis," a voice called out. It was Claire, his assistant. "There's something you need to see." She stepped inside, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. "It's about the mayor. She's been pulled into something. There's a scandal, an investigation into some of her financial dealings. It's all over the news." Malcolm's heart sank. This wasn't just a political obstacle anymore, it was something much more dangerous. If the mayor was caught in a corruption scandal, any chance Malcolm had to push his program forward would vanish in an instant. The city council, especially Hayes, would use this as an excuse to pull back from everything he had been fighting for. "I need to get to the press conference," Malcolm said, his voice low and controlled. "Now." Mitchell stepped forward, looking more anxious than usual. "Malcolm, are you sure this is the right time? The mayor's situation is only going to make things more complicated. If you don't handle this carefully, it could ruin everything." Malcolm didn't reply. His gaze locked on Claire as she handed him a tablet. He scrolled through the news articles that flashed across the screen. His jaw tightened. The scandal was already starting to make headlines. The mayor had been linked to several illegal campaign contributions, and now the city was in an uproar. He knew this would be the end of his efforts. But then, a thought flashed through his mind. The mayor may have fallen, but Malcolm wasn't just going to let the city collapse under the weight of corruption and neglect. He wasn't going to let them win. "I'll handle it," Malcolm said, his voice now a hardened resolve. "It's not just about the mayor anymore, it's about making sure the people who've been forgotten get what they deserve." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. "Malcolm, this isn't just about healthcare anymore. The press will have a field day with your involvement in this mess." "I know," he replied, his tone resolute. "But I'm not backing down. Not this time." Later that day, Malcolm stood in front of the city courthouse, the scene buzzing with activity. Reporters stood in clumps, cameras flashing as they spoke with officials and onlookers. The scandal surrounding the mayor had made national news, and now Elmsford was on the brink of a crisis. Malcolm had arrived earlier than expected, wanting to get ahead of the story and take control of the narrative. But the moment he stepped out of his car, he felt the shift. The security guard at the entrance, a tall man with a stern face, looked up as Malcolm approached. There was an instant hesitation in his gaze, a flicker of recognition that quickly morphed into something colder, more judgmental. He didn't immediately step aside to let Malcolm pass. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, his tone flat. Malcolm felt a flash of irritation rise in his chest, but he kept his composure. "I'm here for the press conference," he said, his voice measured. "Dr. Malcolm Ellis." The guard gave him a long, appraising look, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. You'll have to wait outside." Malcolm's stomach tightened. He could feel the disapproval hanging in the air. "Excuse me, I don't think you understand. I'm the CEO of St. James Hospital. The press conference is about the healthcare initiative." The guard's expression remained unchanged. "I'm afraid I can't let you through, sir. It's only for invited officials." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. "I'm an invited official," Malcolm said, his voice growing firm. "I'm the one they've been waiting for." The guard looked past him toward the other reporters, then back to Malcolm. "You can't just walk in here like you own the place. There's a process you should have checked in." Every muscle in Malcolm's body tensed, and for a moment, he was tempted to lash out. But something in him stopped. This wasn't the time for that. He had to be strategic. He couldn't allow himself to fall into the trap of reacting with anger, no matter how justified it felt. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back. "I'm not leaving," Malcolm said. His voice was calm, controlled, but his gaze was intense. "Call someone who knows me. Call whoever you need to, but I'm not leaving until I've made my statement." The guard hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously, but he made no move to call anyone. It wasn't until a few moments later that a familiar voice broke through the tension. "Everything all right, officer?" A tall figure in a dark suit appeared from behind, walking toward them. It was Officer Daniels, a man Malcolm had encountered several times over the years. Daniels' gaze landed on Malcolm, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of recognition. "Dr. Ellis," he said, his tone suddenly changing. "Didn't expect to see you here." Malcolm gave a tight nod, his resolve unshaken. "I'm here for the press conference. I'm an invited guest." Officer Daniels eyed the guard for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Let him through," he said, his voice cold. As Malcolm walked past them, the weight of the moment settled over him. He was about to step into the belly of the beast, into a room full of people who had been fighting against him from the start. But it didn't matter. He was ready to make his stand. Malcolm's heart raced as he stepped past the security guard and into the courthouse. The tension was thick in the air as he walked down the corridor. The sound of his footsteps was drowned out by the murmur of voices from the press, the clicking of cameras, and the occasional sharp, authoritative tone of police officers directing people. His mind was laser-focused. This was the moment he had been waiting for. A chance to make his voice heard, to show the people of Elmsford that he was not just another black man trying to make a difference in a world determined to shut him down. His hand tightened around the strap of his briefcase, a reminder of everything he had worked for, everything he had fought through to get to this point. He had earned his place here. He wasn't going to let anyone strip that from him. When he reached the press conference room, a sea of reporters turned to look at him. A few whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They hadn't expected someone like him to walk through the door. They expected someone more polished, more conforming. But Malcolm was done playing by anyone else's rules. Councilman Hayes was already there, standing at the podium with a microphone in his hand. His sharp eyes flickered toward Malcolm, narrowing just slightly. The smile he flashed was tight, almost forced. It was clear that Hayes wasn't happy to see him. It was also clear that he didn't see Malcolm as an ally. but as a threat. "Dr. Ellis?" Hayes said coolly, stepping aside to allow Malcolm to approach. "It's good to see you. I didn't expect you to make it here after the distractions of the day." Malcolm's lips pressed together in a tight line. "I'm here because the people of this city need to know what's at stake. The mayor may have her issues, but that doesn't change the fact that the community still needs healthcare." Hayes's eyes flickered with disdain. "Indeed," he replied, his tone dismissive. "But I'm afraid your vision is a bit ambitious, don't you think?" Malcolm stood tall, facing him with a steely resolve. "The people who need help don't care about your political games, Councilman. They care about their lives, and I'm not backing down." A low murmur ran through the crowd as they shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm could feel the eyes of the room on him, some judging, some curious, others openly hostile. But he had made up his mind. This was his fight for respect, for fairness, for something bigger than himself. A reporter raised their hand. "Dr. Ellis, what do you think of the mayor's involvement in this financial scandal? Do you think that impacts your initiative?" Malcolm's eyes flickered briefly toward the side of the room, where a few of the mayor's loyalists stood, their faces tight with discomfort. The mayor's scandal had shifted the city's focus away from the actual issues, the real problems that people faced, but he wouldn't let that derail the work he had done. "The mayor's actions are her own," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't change the reality on the ground. People are suffering. The people I've dedicated my career to. They need help, and that's what I'm here to do. This initiative isn't about political careers, it's about saving lives." A few reporters nodded, writing furiously in their notebooks. But before anyone could respond, the door to the press room suddenly swung open, and a tall figure stepped inside. Officer Daniels. Malcolm felt his body tense. He had seen Daniels before, a man whose authority carried an air of arrogance. He was known for his hardline stance on any issue, and he didn't seem to have much tolerance for people who challenged the status quo. It was the look in his eyes that made Malcolm wary. A quiet judgment that was more than just disdain. It was a readiness to dismiss him, to make him smaller than he truly was. "Dr. Ellis," Daniels said, his voice carrying through the room, "the police have been instructed to keep a close eye on this situation. We can't have any disruptions, especially with all the attention this scandal is getting. I'd suggest you stick to the script." Malcolm held Daniels' gaze, refusing to let the intimidation seep in. He had heard rumors about the police force in Elmsford and how some of its members had been less than supportive of his initiatives. They didn't want change. They didn't want people like him taking the lead. "I'm not here to be anyone's puppet, officer," Malcolm said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm here to make sure the voices of the people are heard." Daniel's lips twitched into a tight smile. "I'm sure. But I'd be careful if I were you. You never know how these things might turn out." The implied threat hung in the air, as palpable as the tension in the room. The reporters seemed to sense it too, their eyes darting between Malcolm and Daniels, unsure of how the moment would unfold. A few of the mayor's supporters exchanged glances, whispering quietly among themselves. Malcolm felt the weight of their scrutiny, but he refused to be intimidated. He took a deep breath and stepped forward to the podium, his resolve hardening like steel. "I don't need to be careful," Malcolm said, his voice rising just enough to catch the attention of the room. "What I need is for the people in this city to start recognizing that their neighbors, their friends, their families deserve better than what they're getting right now." A reporter raised her hand. "So, Dr. Ellis, you're saying that despite the mayor's troubles, you intend to push forward with your healthcare initiative regardless of the political implications?" Malcolm nodded firmly. "I don't care about the politics. I care about the people who are dying without access to the care they need. If the mayor's scandal has shown us anything, it's that the people in power don't always have their priorities straight. But I do. And that's why I'm here." There was a tense silence in the room, broken only by the sound of a few cameras clicking. Daniels shifted uncomfortably behind him, clearly not pleased with the direction the conversation was going. But Malcolm didn't care anymore. He had already made up his mind. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one. He wouldn't back down. Not this time. Just as he was about to continue, a loud bang echoed through the courthouse. The doors slammed open, and a group of officers poured into the room. Their presence was overwhelming, and the air seemed to snap with electricity. Malcolm turned to see Daniels, his face hardening, motioning toward him. "Dr. Ellis," Daniels said, his voice ice-cold, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Malcolm froze, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he was imagining the threat, the tension thickening around him. The officers advanced, their steps deliberate, the message clear. Malcolm was no longer in control of the situation. "On what grounds?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice steady, despite the growing panic in his chest. He knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to discredit him, to make him look like just another black man who couldn't be trusted in a place of power. Daniels didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just nodded toward the officers, signaling them to move in closer. "This is unnecessary," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "I've done nothing wrong." "I suggest you come with us, Dr. Ellis," Daniels said, his voice now laced with finality. Malcolm's mind raced. He couldn't afford to be dragged away. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. He had worked too hard to get to this point. This was no longer just about the initiative. This was about everything he had fought for, everything he had proven to himself, to his community, and to the world. He felt his pulse quicken, the room closing in around him as the officers stepped forward, their hands now on his arms. He didn't move. Instead, he stood tall, his eyes fixed on Officer Daniels, daring him to make the first move. Malcolm's heart pounded as the officers closed in on him, their heavy steps echoing like thunder in the small courthouse press room. The tension in the air was thick, every eye in the room trained on him. He could feel the cameras clicking in rapid succession, the reporters whispering among themselves, but he refused to let it break his focus. This was the moment he had been dreading, but also anticipating. The moment when everything could either come crashing down or finally break through. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his face cold, his hands clasped behind his back like he was some authority figure who could dictate the rules. But Malcolm was done being the silent, compliant figure that they expected him to be. He had been told his entire life where he belonged, and it was never in positions of power. Now, as they tried to push him down yet again, he could feel the fury rising, but he held it back, the sharp sting of injustice replaced with clarity. "Dr. Ellis, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Daniels said, his tone firm, but there was an underlying smirk in his voice. He wasn't making an invitation, he was issuing an order. Malcolm stood his ground, his eyes locking onto Daniels. "You're not asking, you're commanding." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. He wasn't going to move unless he had a damn good reason. "And I'm not going anywhere." Daniels' lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "You're making a mistake, Ellis. I suggest you don't make this harder than it needs to be." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the officers flanked him. Every journalist in the room was watching, the cameras snapping pictures, their lenses capturing the moment when Malcolm was about to be publicly humiliated. The stakes were higher than ever. If he backed down now, everything he had worked for would be undermined, dismissed. The message would be clear. A black man, no matter his success, could never challenge the system. "Harder?" Malcolm repeated, his voice rising with a controlled intensity. "You want me to make this harder? I've been fighting this system my whole life. Every single day, I've fought to prove that I belong in this space. No matter how many times people like you tell me I don't, but I'm done playing your game, I'm not going anywhere." Officer Daniels' smile vanished. He took a step forward, his broad shoulders looming over Malcolm. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Malcolm could feel his pulse quicken, but he refused to show fear. The world had been trying to make him feel small for too long. He wouldn't let it happen now. "Listen, Ellis," Daniel said, his voice low, barely contained. "You're playing a dangerous game. You think you're something special, don't you? All that money, all those degrees, you still don't belong in this world, and you know it. No matter how many times you try to dress it up, you're just another black man trying to force your way into spaces you were never meant to occupy." The words hit Malcolm like a slap, but instead of anger, something else surged inside him. This was it. This was what he had been fighting against. Officer Daniels had just revealed the ugly truth, the truth that had been festering beneath the surface of every meeting, every conversation, every closed door. This wasn't about healthcare. This was about control. This was about keeping people like him in their place, no matter how much they achieved. Malcolm's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his breathing steady. You think that's going to stop me? Because you can't stand to see someone like me in a place of power. You've underestimated me, Officer Daniels. You've underestimated what I'm willing to do to change this city. And I'm not backing down. A hush fell over the room. The reporters were silent now, watching with bated breath. Daniels looked around, as if searching for a way to regain control of the situation. But there was no turning back now. You think you're some kind of hero? Daniels sneered. You're just another pawn in a game you don't understand. The mayor's scandal, your little initiative. None of it matters. You're all just distractions. People like you don't get to rewrite the rules. The system is bigger than you. Malcolm's jaw tightened, the words slicing through him. But as much as they stung, they only fueled his determination. Daniels had just shown him the ugly reality. The system wasn't broken because of the people in it. It was broken because of the people who wanted to keep it that way. And no matter how hard they tried, no matter how many times they tried to silence him, he wasn't going to let them win. I'm not a distraction, officer, Malcolm said, his voice cold, unwavering. I'm a force. And the people you're trying to suppress, they've been fighting for their lives long before I ever walked into this room. If you think I'm going to walk away just because you tell me to, then you don't know who you're dealing with. The room was dead silent now, every eye fixed on him. Daniels was livid, his face flushing with frustration. The officers beside him shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in power. They had expected a meek, compliant response. But Malcolm wasn't just another person to push around. Daniels's hands clenched at his sides, his eyes narrowing. You want to be a hero? He spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. I'll show you what happens when you stand up to people who can put you in your place. Before Malcolm could respond, Daniels stepped forward, his hand reaching toward him, in a move that felt like an attempt to physically assert control over the situation. But Malcolm was ready. His years of training, his experience under pressure, all of it had prepared him for a moment like this. In one swift motion, he stepped back and raised his hand, blocking Daniels' reach. The room seemed to hold its breath. The officers behind Daniels looked uncertain, glancing between their commanding officer and Malcolm, unsure of what to do next. You want to put me in my place? Malcolm said, his voice now low, firm. You want to show me what happens when I stand up to you. You don't get to define what I am, what I'm capable of. You don't get to control me, no matter how much power you think you have. Daniels hesitated, his lips curling into a snarl. For a moment, it looked like he might try to escalate things physically to force Malcolm out of the room. But Malcolm stood his ground, his posture unyielding, his eyes locked onto Daniels in a silent challenge. The room was still. Not a sound except the faint rustle of papers and the quiet click of camera shutters. And then, the unexpected happened. Mitchell, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, stepped forward, his face flushed with anxiety, but also a hint of resolve. Enough, Daniels, he said, his voice shaky but clear. This isn't about you, this is about the people who need help. You're not going to intimidate Dr. Ellis. Daniels turned to Mitchell, his eyes blazing with anger. You're speaking out of turn. You don't know what you're dealing with. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Mitchell said, his voice gaining strength. And I'm not backing down either. The people you're trying to silence, they're the ones who matter. And if you're too blinded by your own biases to see that, then maybe it's time for you to step aside. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel's eyes flashed, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then, as if realizing he had lost control of the situation, he took a step back, his posture stiff with rage. You think this is over? Daniels hissed, his voice dripping with venom. You've only just started a war, you can't win. Malcolm didn't flinch. I've been in this war my entire life, officer, he said, his voice steady, unwavering. And I'll keep fighting until the end. Daniels turned and motioned for the officers to follow him. He didn't speak again, but the lingering tension in the room was palpable. As he walked away, the crowd in the press room slowly began to stir, the murmur of voices growing louder. Malcolm stood there, his body tense but resolute. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. But for the first time, he could feel the weight of his resolve, his refusal to back down, taking root in his soul. He wasn't going to let them silence him. Not now, not ever. Malcolm could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him as Officer Daniels took a step back. The entire courthouse press room had fallen into an eerie silence. Cameras were still flashing, reporters were holding their breath, and even the officers who had initially surrounded him were now standing at attention, uncertain of what to do next. Malcolm had challenged Daniels, and by extension, the system, and for the first time in his life, it felt like he might actually be winning. Daniels, his face a mask of fury, glared at him, his hand still twitching toward the sidearm at his waist. But Malcolm refused to back down, his body rigid with the weight of everything at stake. This was more than just a confrontation over healthcare or political maneuvering. This was the moment where Malcolm Ellis would either be crushed by the weight of systemic prejudice or rise above it, showing the world that he belonged at the table, and that his success was not just a fluke. Daniels took a deep breath, as though trying to regain control of himself. His voice was low, but it carried the bitter edge of someone used to being in charge, someone who saw Malcolm as an inconvenience, a challenge to everything they had worked to uphold. "You really think you're going to change anything, Ellis?" Daniels's voice was a sneer, dripping with condescension. "You're a surgeon, a CEO, a hero to your little community. But that's all it is. Little. You're still just one black man trying to force yourself into spaces where you'll never truly belong." Malcolm felt the old familiar fire burning in his chest, the anger he'd long suppressed. He had heard those words, or their variants, countless times before, each time delivered with an underlying contempt. His mind flashed back to every moment in his career, when people had told him, subtly or not, that he didn't belong. But this time, as Daniel spoke, Malcolm didn't feel the shame he had once felt. This time, he felt a quiet, unshakable confidence. "You're wrong," Malcolm said, his voice steady, but louder now, forcing everyone in the room to hear. "I don't belong because you say so, I belong because I've earned my place. Not by playing by the rules you set, but by doing what you and your kind never thought I could, by succeeding when you thought I'd fail, and I'm not going anywhere." The reporters in the room began to murmur, sensing the intensity of the moment, but Daniels's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. He had never been challenged like this before, not by someone who wasn't afraid to speak back. "You think you've earned this?" Daniels spat, his anger flaring. "You're just another pawn in a game you don't understand. A pawn they'll throw away as soon as they're done with you. You're not one of them, Ellis. You're never going to be." Malcolm felt his stomach churn with the bitterness of Daniels' words. The depth of his hatred was clear now. This wasn't just about power or politics. This was about something far uglier. Daniels wasn't just fighting against Malcolm's healthcare initiative, he was fighting against Malcolm himself. He couldn't stand the thought of someone like Malcolm, someone who had fought tooth and nail to break through systemic barriers, succeeding in a world that was supposed to shut him out. Malcolm stood tall, his eyes unwavering. "You know what I think you're scared, Daniels? I think you're scared because I'm everything you never wanted me to be. I'm black, successful, and I'm making a difference, and that terrifies you." For a moment, Daniels looked like he might explode. His hand clenched around the grip of his holster, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. Malcolm could see the conflict in his eyes, a deep-seated rage that had built up over years of entitlement and prejudice. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Daniel's voice had lowered to a dangerous growl, each word dripping with venom. "You're just a puppet, and the moment you stop dancing to their tune, they'll throw you away, just like they always do. That's the truth, Ellis. You'll never be enough for them, you'll never win." The words hit Malcolm like a physical blow, but he refused to let them break him. He had heard that lie before, but now, standing in this room, with all eyes on him, he realized something. Daniel's words weren't just an insult, they were a confession. They were a glimpse into the depths of the systemic corruption that had been festering in this town for years. It wasn't just about healthcare, it wasn't even about politics, it was about power. The power to control who belonged and who didn't. The power to keep people like Malcolm from ever truly succeeding. "I'm not a puppet, Daniels," Malcolm said, his voice ringing clear in the tense silence. "And I'm not going anywhere." He could feel the eyes of the reporters on him, the weight of the moment pressing in. This was his stand. His moment to show the world that no matter how hard they tried to break him, he would always rise. But the threat was far from over. As Daniel's frustration boiled over, he took another step forward, his voice turning darker. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? That you're above the law? But I can make this disappear, Ellis. I can make you disappear." The words hit Malcolm like a slap. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air, and for a moment, he wondered if Daniels was serious. Was he going to use his power to get rid of him? Would he throw him under the bus to save his own reputation? But then, Malcolm realized, this was what they always did. They attacked the messenger when they couldn't attack the message. They couldn't shut down his ideas, so they tried to destroy him instead. This was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life, the moment when he would have to make a choice. Would he bow to the system, or would he stand up and show them that no matter how many times they tried to knock him down, he would always rise? He stepped forward, his gaze unflinching. "You don't scare me, Daniels," he said, his voice quiet but powerful. "You don't control me. You don't control this city. And you sure as hell don't control what's coming next." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough. Both of you." It was Mitchell. His voice was shaky, but it carried with it a sense of finality. He stepped between Malcolm and Daniels, his hand held up in a gesture of peace. "This has gone far enough," Mitchell said, his eyes darting nervously between the two men. "We're not here to fight. We're here to get this city the help it needs." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Daniels took a step back, his expression one of reluctant acceptance. "You're lucky, Ellis," he muttered. "You're lucky I don't have the power to make you disappear right here, right now. But know this. You'll never win. Not in this city, not against people like me." He turned on his heel and strode toward the door, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silent room. The officers hesitated for a moment, then followed suit, leaving Malcolm standing there, his body tense with the adrenaline of the confrontation. Malcolm didn't move at first. His heart was still racing, his mind still processing the exchange, but slowly, his resolve hardened. This was just the beginning. He had faced down the worst of them, and they hadn't won. He had fought for the people he cared about, for the community that had supported him when the world told him he couldn't succeed, and he wasn't going to stop now. The reporters, sensing the shift in the room, began to murmur, some turning back to their cameras, others scribbling notes in their pads. The atmosphere had changed. The tension that had once been suffocating now felt like an open space, waiting to be filled with new possibilities. Mitchell turned to Malcolm, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "That was something," he said, his voice hoarse. "But it's not over. You've got more to do. They won't just let you win." "Not like this." Malcolm nodded, his gaze fixed on the door through which Daniels had just walked. "I know, but I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." The room was still buzzing with reporters, their voices rising as they spoke in excited, hurried tones. Malcolm stood in the middle of it all, trying to steady his breath, his mind still processing the confrontation with Officer Daniels. He had stood his ground. He had faced the bully who represented the system that had tried to break him down for years, and for the first time, it felt like he had won. But the victory wasn't just his own. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Mitchell walked up to him, his face pale, but his eyes bright with something that resembled respect. "That was incredible," Mitchell said quietly, as though speaking to himself more than Malcolm. "I didn't think anyone could stand up to Daniels like that." Malcolm gave a small, exhausted smile. "He's just a man, Mitchell, and no one's invincible." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they'd just witnessed. For a moment, they simply stood there, the energy of the room swirling around them. The press had been forced to witness the power dynamics shift, the moment when the system had tried to crush someone it deemed unworthy, only to be faced with someone who wouldn't be silenced. As the reporters continued to ask questions, Mitchell motioned for Malcolm to follow him outside the press room. "We need to talk. There's more happening right now than just you standing up to Daniels." Malcolm felt a pang of concern. What do you mean? Mitchell glanced over his shoulder, his voice low. It's starting, people are talking. You've made it clear that this isn't just about a healthcare initiative anymore, it's about standing up to a broken system. And the truth is starting to come out about Daniels. People are noticing, some of the other officers are talking too. I think this might be the start of something. Malcolm's heart quickened. What do you mean by the truth? Mitchell's voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper. There's been talk about Daniels for a while. Corruption, abuse of power. He's been protecting certain interests, turning a blind eye to some things that shouldn't have been ignored. The mayor's scandal just gave everyone an excuse to dig deeper. Malcolm stared at Mitchell, his mind racing. This wasn't just about healthcare or politics. This was about something much deeper. Something that had been festering beneath the surface for years. Officer Daniels wasn't just a product of a broken system. He was a part of the system, and the power he wielded wasn't just about enforcement, it was about control. But even as Malcolm absorbed the gravity of Mitchell's words, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The conversation that had begun in that courthouse, about systemic corruption, about breaking down barriers, was starting to grow. People were starting to listen. And that was the first step in creating the change that Malcolm had always dreamed of.